This is an article from the Reformed Presbyterian, Volume 2, published in June of 1838, a continuation from an older article from an earlier edition of the magazine, entitled The Waldenses. Dreadful as was the havoc thus made of the Vaudois, they were far from being extirpated. In the county of Toulouse and Languedoc, they existed in great numbers, and seemed, notwithstanding their oppressions, even to stretch forth the curtains of their habitations. Here it was that the attempt to destroy the Albigenses by means of the Crusades was first made, and here a footnote. A crusade properly denotes a war in defense of the cross. The desolating wars of the Roman pontiffs against the Saracens and the Waldenses were given this name not only from the object on account of which they were undertaken, but because each warrior was distinguished by the sign of the cross. The plan had already been tried in endeavoring to dispossess the followers of Mohammed of the land of Judea, and now it was again called into operation for the purpose of rooting out from the earth the unoffending dissenters from a worldly and anti-Christian establishment. The Pope dispatched letters to the different European powers who acknowledged his ghostly dominion, inviting them to take up arms for exterminating the heretics. And here a footnote. The bull which His Holiness issued on this occasion is a specimen of papal clemency, and a full confirmation of the declaration of divine truth, quote, "Tender mercies of the wicked are cruel," unquote. It expressly tells those to whom it is addressed that, quote, "they were not to keep faith with those who did not keep faith with God," unquote. And it proceeds in these terms, quote, "We exhort you that you would endeavor to destroy the wicked heresy of the Albigenses, and do this with more vigor than you would towards the Saracens themselves. Persecute them with a strong hand, deprive them of their lands and possessions, banish them, and put Roman Catholics in their room," unquote. That from Clarke's Martyrology 124. And his legate, accompanied by 12 abbots of the Cistercian order, was joined by Dominic, the founder of the Inquisition, and others of the same confraternity, traveled into various places, preaching the crusade and promising by the authority of His Holiness a plenary remission of sins and, at death, admission to paradise to all who would take up the cross and serve 40 days against the Albigenses. In this time of thick darkness, the slavish subjection of princes to papal domination was so abject, and the ignorance of the people so great, that at this invitation considerable numbers collected for this unholy enterprise, and prepared to shed in torrents the blood of the saints. To cover the undertaking of the semblance of justice before the hostilities commenced, the Romish party pretended that they were inclined to show mercy, and that they might appear desirous of winning them rather by persuasion than violence, proposed to hold a public conference with the pastors and leaders of the Waldenses on the points wherein they differed from the Church of Rome. This was but a maneuver designed to gain time for warlike preparations, and to take more easily their unsuspecting victims in the snare. The proposal was accepted, however, by the Waldenses, and the conference was held in the year 1306 near Carcassonne, the umpires on the occasion being the Bishop of Villeneuve and Auxerre on the Catholic side, and R. de Bot, and Antony Rivet on that of their opponents. Of the Waldensian pastors who took part in this discussion, the principal was Arnold Hott. He undertook to prove that the Mass and transubstantiation are idolatrous and unscriptural, that the Church of Rome is not the spouse of Christ, and that his government and practices are pernicious and wicked. After allowing 15 days to the Catholic bishops to reply to the propositions which he advanced on these subjects, he reasoned in a public assembly for 4 days successively against the arguments of the Romanists, with such fluency and power that a strong impression was made on the minds of many of the audience. That taken from Perrin's History of the Albigenses, B3C3. What reply the papal party made to the arguments of this intrepid advocate of the truth we are not informed, but the disastrous termination of the dispute is circumstantially related by historians on the one side and the other. While the discussion was carrying on, and an immense multitude of the Waldenses were assembled, waiting with eager expectation the issue, the army of the Crusaders advanced, and terminated the controversy according to the frequent practice of the Roman Church by the unresisted slaughter of their opponents. A great number of the time perished, and, in the short space of a few months, the crusade succeeded so well, according to the wishes of Innocent, that it is calculated not less than 200,000 of these unoffending victims of papal rage, of all ranks and conditions, were destroyed. There have been writers even so base as to justify such relentless barbarity. The Platiana, a Roman Catholic historian, gives unconscious testimony to the prevalence of the Waldensian faith and to the steadfastness of its adherents, which he says, quote, "There was need not only of disputation, but of arms also. To such a pitch was the heresy grown." Unquote. After this conference thus tragically terminated, the armies of the Crusaders were intent upon their work of destruction. Jehovah, however, in his righteous providence, frequently vindicates the cause of his afflicted people, makes manifest to all the cruelty and injustice of their oppressors, and raises up for them friends and protectors, even among those who have not fully seen the excellence of their testimony. Thus was it in the case of the suffering Waldenses at this gloomy period of their history. Several of the nobility who had possessions in the southern provinces of France had found them peaceful and industrious subjects, and, without any peculiar attachment to the faith which they held, they were, on this account, inclined to cherish and protect them. Among the most powerful of these was Raymond, Lord of Toulouse, who at first permitted the Waldenses to settle in his country, and afterwards continued to protect them, even when they were exposed to the combined violence of the Inquisition and the Crusaders. The clemency of this generous nobleman was highly displeasing to the sovereign pontiff and the court of Rome. Every method was tried to induce him to embark in the sanguinary projects of the persecutors, and to banish and deliver up his unoffending subjects to their rage, and when the acts of persuasion were found unavailing for this purpose, he was assailed in a different way, with harshness and severity. The Pope wrote to him in the most haughty and arrogant style. His country was laid under an interdict. And here a footnote. In the Dark Ages, an interdict was a powerful instrument for compelling the slavish subjection of the secular powers to pontifical usurpation. By it, a whole nation was deprived at once of the offices of religion. The business of life was, in a great measure, suspended. The churches were shut, the dead were not interred in the usual burying places, but were thrown into ditches or buried in common fields. Marriage was celebrated in the churchyards, and the people were required to fast, neglect their apparel, and everywhere to exhibit symptoms of the deepest distress, and of immediate apprehension of divine indignation. All this was done at the caprice and to gratify the ambition of the head of the Romish Church. And the occasion which called forth this terrible sentence was frequently no case of immorality nor error in the faith, but merely resistance to some monstrous act of papal domination. See Hume's History of England, Reign of John. His country was laid under an interdict, and he himself excommunicated. In this age of darkness, those papal menaces carried with them a force and a terror which it was no easy matter to withstand, and accordingly Raymond, though still disposed to favor his oppressed subjects, saw inevitable ruin pending over him, if he continued to protect them, and he therefore made his submission to the court of Rome. It has ever been the practice of this anti-Christian power to degrade in their own eyes and those of others such as have been compelled to obedience. Raymond was required to make his submission before the gates of several churches, in the presence of many dignitaries and a vast concourse of people, and to swear by the Eucharist and the relics of the saints, an oath esteemed peculiarly solemn, that he would obey the commands of the Holy Roman Catholic Church. He was then scourged with a whip till his naked body was lacerated with stripes, and afterwards absolved. And as if this were not sufficient degradation for a nobleman of high rank and extensive possessions, he was commanded to engage in bearing the cross against the heretics, and imperatively required to exterminate his own unoffending subjects. The nephew of the Earl of Toulouse was Raymond Roger, who was styled Earl of Béziers, from a town of that name, the capital of his dominions. This intrepid youth, though in the communion of the Romish Church, perceived at once the injustice of these requisitions, and, probably feeling indignant at the degradation of his relative, he refused to take part in carrying them into execution. Upon his retiring in disgust from the presence of the Pope's legate, and preparing to set his states in a posture of defense against the aggressions of the Crusaders, his uncle was compelled to agree, and not only to extirpate the Albigenses, from his dominions, but also to carry his arms against his own kinsmen. Timid as was the disposition of Raymond, on reflection, he was overwhelmed with grief at this part of the stipulation. The voice of natural affection, as well as of humility, pleaded with him to retire from the degrading service. He solicited leave to take a journey to Rome, that he might humble himself before the sovereign pontiff. This request could not be denied, and the Count left the army, choosing any personal degradation rather than continue in a situation where he would have been forced to be a, quote, spectator of the murder of thousands of peaceable and virtuous men and the ruin of his own nephew, unquote.